December 7, 1941, a date that would echo through eternity. As Japanese bombs tore through the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, as battleships capsized and men burned in oil, slicked waters, as 4U-3 Americans died in a single morning of fire and fury, the United States found itself thrust into a war it had desperately tried to avoid. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese juggernaut swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed. Wake Island fell. Guam surrendered. The Philippines collapsed. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, one by one, they tumbled like dominoes before the rising sun. By early 1942, Japan controlled an empire spanning 3,000 miles. The Pacific Ocean had become a Japanese lake. American forces reeled backward, defeated, demoralized, outgunned. The situation was desperate, the outlook grim, and yet, in those darkest hours, American military planners were already conceiving a strategy that would change the nature of warfare itself. A strategy that would transform the vast emptiness of the Pacific from Japan's greatest shield into its ultimate tomb. This is the story of island hopping. This is the story of how industrial might, tactical innovation, and unimaginable sacrifice turned the tide of the Pacific War. This is the story of young men who crossed oceans of death to storm beaches of volcanic ash, of commanders who gambled with thousands of lives on the turn of a map, of a 3-year campaign that would claim over 100,000 American lives and destroy the military power of Imperial Japan. This is the story of how America learned to wage war across 64 million square miles of ocean. The strategic reality facing American commanders in early 1942 was brutal in its simplicity. The Japanese Empire now controlled a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, from Burma in the west to Wake Island in the east. Behind this shield of conquered territory lay the home islands of Japan. Untouchable, unreachable, triumphant. The traditional American War Plan Orange, had envisioned a direct thrust across the Pacific, capturing every Japanese held island in sequence until American forces could finally assault the Japanese homeland. But that plan had been written in peacetime, by men who had never imagined the scale of the disaster at Pearl Harbor. With America's battleship fleet crippled, with bases lost, with thousands of Americans imprisoned or dead, that plan was now impossible. Worse, Allied strategy demanded that Germany be defeated first. The majority of American war production, 60 to 70%, would flow to Europe, not the Pacific. American commanders in the Pacific would have to win their war with whatever scraps remained. They would have to be creative. They would have to be ruthless. They would have to invent a new way of waging war. Two men would forge that new way. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. They were as different as fire and ice. MacArthur, flamboyant and theatrical, driven by ego and a burning desire to redeem his promise to return to the Philippines. Nimitz, quiet and methodical, focused on the cold mathematics of naval warfare. Together, whether they liked it or not, they would have to find a path to Tokyo. But first, they had to stop the bleeding. In August 1942, American Marines splashed ashore on a steaming, malaria-infested island in the Solomon chain called Guadalcanal. It was supposed to be a limited operation. Seize the airfield the Japanese were building, deny them a base to threaten supply routes to Australia. It turned into a 6-month nightmare of savage fighting on land, sea, and air that would cost more than 600 American lives and kill over 24,000 Japanese. The Marines landed on August 7, quickly capturing the incomplete airfield they would name Henderson Field, after a pilot killed at Midway. But the Japanese were not about to let this insult stand. They poured reinforcements onto the island, determined to crush the American invaders. What followed was unlike anything American forces had experienced before. The jungle was an enemy as lethal as any Japanese soldier. Marines collapsed from malaria, dysentery ravaged units, and tropical ulcers ate through flesh. Men fought in 100-degree heat with 100% humidity. They drank fated water from shell holes. They watched their buddies die from diseases that had no cure. from wounds that festered in the tropical rot. And then there were the Japanese. Fanatical, ferocious, refusing to surrender, they launched suicidal banzai charges, screaming in the darkness, bayonets fixed. Determined to die for their emperor, they infiltrated American lines at night, cutting throats, sowing terror. On October 24 and 25, a single Marine battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, Chesty, Puller, held Henderson Field against 2 entire Japanese regiments. For 48 hours, they fought in hand-to-hand combat, their positions overrun again and again, clinging to their ground through sheer stubbornness and firepower. Gunnery Sergeant John Bass alone manned a machine gun for 2 days without sleep, killing hundreds of Japanese attackers. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Most of the men who fought beside him would receive only unmarked graves in the jungle. At sea, the situation was equally desperate. In a series of savage naval battles, Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, and finally, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, American and Japanese warships tore each other apart in night actions, so confused and violent that sailors could see the faces of enemy gunners across 100 yards of water. The waters around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound, for all the ships that rested on the ocean floor. 2 American admirals, Daniel Callaghan and Norman Scott, died in surface action, the only 2 U.S. Navy admirals killed that way in the entire war. But by February 1943, it was over. The Japanese evacuated their remaining troops from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. The first major American offensive of the Pacific War had succeeded. More importantly, American commanders had learned brutal lessons about jungle warfare, amphibious operations, and the ferocity of their enemy. Lessons written in blood, but lessons nonetheless. And in the aftermath of Guadalcanal, as they planned the next step forward, American planners made a crucial decision. Instead of fighting for every island, bleeding for every atoll, they would bypass Japanese strongholds, isolate them, leave them to wither on the vine. As MacArthur would say, they would seize lightly defended islands that could support the next advance, build airfields and bases, then leap forward again, always moving closer to Japan. The strategy of island hopping was born. The genius of island hopping lay in its simplicity. Why storm a fortress when you could simply walk past it? Why sacrifice thousands of lives capturing heavily defended positions when you could isolate them, cut their supply lines, render them irrelevant? The first test came at Rabaul. The Japanese had turned this base on New Britain into a fortress, 100,000 troops, massive air and naval facilities, impenetrable defenses. Traditional military doctrine demanded its capture. MacArthur and Nimitz decided to bypass it entirely. As MacArthur's forces advanced along the northern coast of New Guinea and Admiral William Bull Halsey's forces drove through the Solomon Islands, Rabaul found itself surrounded by American air and naval power, but never directly assaulted. American submarines strangled its supply lines. Allied bombers pounded it relentlessly. The 100,000 Japanese troops stationed there spent the rest of the war eating grass and watching the war pass them by. Not a single American ground soldier died assaulting Rabaul. It was a revolution in military thinking. But the strategy had to be tested against a defended target. That test came in November 1943, at an obscure atoll in the Gilbert Islands most Americans had never heard of, Tarawa. Tarawa was tiny. The main island of BTO measured just 700 yards wide and 2 miles long, roughly the size of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., but the Japanese had transformed it into a killing ground. Rear Admiral Kiji Shibasaki commanded 500 troops protected by 500 concrete pillboxes, fortified bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire. He had boasted that 1 million Americans could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He was wrong. But the price would be terrible. On November 20, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal, climbed into their landing craft and headed for shore. The naval bombardment had been impressive. Thousands of shells poured into the tiny island. Surely, the Marines thought, nothing could have survived that. They were wrong. As the first wave approached in their new amphibious tractors, they discovered a nightmare. The tide was lower than predicted. landing craft hung up on the coral reef surrounding the island, 500 yards from shore. Marines had to abandon their boats and wade through chest-deep water under withering fire from Japanese machine guns and artillery that had survived the bombardment untouched. Men fell by the dozens, then by scores, then by hundreds. The water turned red. Bodies floated in the lagoon. Some Marines never made it to shore. They drowned in the surf, weighted down by their equipment, or were cut down by machine gun fire before they could reach the beach. Those who made it to the seawall found themselves pinned down, unable to advance, unable to retreat, simply trying to survive. For 76 hours, the Marines fought for every yard of Tarawa. They used flamethrowers to burn out bunkers. They threw satchel charges into pillboxes. They fought with grenades, bayonets, and rifle butts in brutal close-quarters combat. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination. Of the 500 defenders, only 17 survived as prisoners, along with 129 Korean laborers. The rest died at their posts. American casualties were staggering. In just over 3 days, 109 Marines were killed and 101 wounded. Newsreel footage of American dead floating in the surf shocked the nation. The public demanded answers. Why so many casualties for such a small island? General Holland Smith, who had commanded the operation, compared the losses to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Families buried their sons and demanded to know if Tarawa had been worth it. But military planners understood what the public did not. Tarawa was a laboratory. Lessons learned there about the need for better reconnaissance, improved naval gunfire procedures, more amphibious tractors, better communication between ships and shore would save thousands of lives in future operations. The blood spilled at Tarawa purchased knowledge that would prove invaluable. More importantly, Tarawa proved that American forces could take even the most heavily defended Japanese position. The myth of invincibility was shattered on both sides. The Japanese learned that their best defenses could not stop the American juggernaut. The Americans learned that they could endure casualties that would have broken armies in previous wars and still complete their mission. As 1943 ended, the two-pronged offensive was in full swing. MacArthur's forces advanced through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Nimitz's forces struck across the Central Pacific through the Gilbert Islands. They were converging on Japan like the jaws of a vice, and nothing the Japanese did could stop them. The strategy was working. Now it had to be perfected. By early 1944, the American war machine was hitting its stride. New Essex-class aircraft carriers joined the fleet at a rate of nearly one per month. The industrial might of America was overwhelming. In 1944 alone, American shipyards would produce more aircraft carriers than Japan had built in its entire history. The balance of power in the Pacific was shifting, irreversibly, toward the Allies. In February 1944, American forces struck the Marshall Islands. This time, they applied the lessons of Tarawa. Instead of weeks of bloody fighting, the Marshalls fell in days. Kwajalein Atoll, the world's largest, was captured in a week at a cost of 372 American dead. Terrible, but nothing like Tarawa. The Japanese lost 870 dead. Eniwetok fell shortly after. The pace of advance was accelerating, but the real prize lay ahead: the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands were close enough to Japan, just 500 miles, that the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. Capturing the Marianas would bring American bombers within striking distance of Tokyo itself. It would crack Japan's inner defensive perimeter. It would be, as one Japanese officer wrote, the beginning of the end. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, the same day Allied forces in Europe were consolidating their D-Day beachheads in Normandy. 2 Marine divisions, the 2nd and 4th, landed on the southwest coast under heavy fire. American intelligence had estimated 15,000 Japanese defenders. There were actually 32,000. The fighting was savage. Japanese defenders occupied the high ground, pouring artillery fire down on the Marines struggling across open ground. At a place the Marines would call Death Valley, bordered by a ridge they named Purple Heart Ridge, for the casualties sustained there. Men died by the hundreds advancing across terrain that offered no cover, no concealment, only death. It took 3 weeks of brutal combat to secure Mount Tapachol, Saipan's highest point. On July 6, knowing defeat was inevitable, the Japanese commander General Yoshitsugu Sato ordered a final banzai charge before committing ritual suicide. At dawn on July 7, 4 Sarosan Japanese soldiers, many armed only with bayonets or improvised spears, charged American positions in a suicidal wave. They overran parts of 2 army battalions before being annihilated by machine gun and artillery fire. American casualties from the charge exceeded 1,000. Japanese casualties were total, but the horror of Saipan wasn't over. As American forces reached the island's northern cliffs, they witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Japanese civilians, convinced by their government that Americans would torture and kill them, jumped from the cliffs by the hundreds. Mothers threw their children into the sea before jumping themselves. American Marines and sailors, watching helplessly from offshore, could hear the screams echoing across the water. An estimated 22,000 Japanese civilians died on Saipan, many by their own hand. The cost in American blood was equally terrible. Over 400 Americans died capturing Saipan, but its capture had consequences that reached far beyond casualty figures. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned. The Japanese people learned for the first time that the war was not going well, and American B-29s began flying missions from Saipan's airfields to bomb the Japanese mainland. The noose was tightening. While the fighting raged on Saipan, the Japanese Navy made one last attempt to destroy American carrier forces in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It would prove to be a massacre. American pilots, flying the superior F-6F Hellcat fighters and protected by sophisticated radar and fighter direction, slaughtered Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, June 19, 1944, American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 29 of their own. The Japanese carrier-based air arm never recovered. It was effectively the end of Japanese naval aviation. Behind every advance, behind every captured island, came the Seabees, the naval construction battalions whose motto was, "We build, we fight." These men, many of them experienced construction workers, in their 30s and 40s, were older than typical combat troops. But they performed miracles of construction under fire, often within hours of the Marines securing a beachhead. On Guadalcanal, Seabees kept Henderson Field operational despite daily Japanese bombing raids, repairing the runway as fast as the Japanese could crater it. At Tarawa, they began constructing facilities while fighting was still ongoing. At Saipan and Tinian, they built the bomber bases that would bring fire from the sky to Japan. They worked through tropical heat, through rain, through disease, and enemy fire. More than 500 Seabees died in accidents or from disease. Another 272 were killed in combat. 33 earned Silver Stars. 5 received Navy Crosses. By the end of 1944, American forces had secured the Marianas. B-29s were bombing Japan, the Philippines beckoned, and Douglas MacArthur was about to fulfill his promise. People of the Philippines, I have returned. General Douglas MacArthur's voice crackled across radio waves on October 20, 1944, as he waded ashore on Leyte Island. It was vintage MacArthur, theatrical, dramatic, calculated for maximum impact. The photograph of him striding through the surf, accompanied by Philippine President Sergio Osmeña, would become one of the most iconic images of the war. But the drama masked a desperate reality. The Philippines would not fall easily. The Japanese understood what was at stake. If the Philippines fell, Japan would be cut off from the oil and raw materials of Southeast Asia. The empire would strangle. They launched Operation Go, Victory Operation, throwing everything they had left into one last desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. The resulting Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23–26, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 naval personnel participated. The Japanese committed virtually their entire remaining fleet. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers. American forces under Admiral William Bull Halsey and Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid met them in a series of engagements spread across 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Japanese came terrifyingly close to success. In the Battle off Samar, a powerful Japanese surface force under Admiral Takeo Kurita stumbled upon a group of 6 American escort carriers, protected only by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The Japanese battleships, including the massive Yamato with its 18-inch guns, should have massacred the vulnerable American ships. Instead, the destroyers charged directly at the Japanese fleet, launching suicidal torpedo attacks that bought time for the carriers to escape. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged into Japanese formation after Japanese formation, firing until her guns were destroyed, then firing with her remaining gun until it too was silenced. Evans went down with his ship, posthumously receiving the Medal of Honor. When the battle ended, the Japanese had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, but the Japanese had one weapon left, the kamikaze. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first organized kamikaze attack sank the escort carrier USS St. Lo and damaged several other ships. It was the beginning of a new nightmare. Japanese pilots, accepting certain death, would deliberately crash their explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Against this tactic, there was no defense except to shoot them down before they reached their targets. The Philippines campaigned ground on through the end of 1944 and into 1945. Manila was liberated in March 1945 after brutal house-to-house fighting that destroyed the city. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians died. The fighting wouldn't officially end until August 1945, but even as MacArthur fought for the Philippines, American planners were already looking ahead to the next 2 stepping stones to Japan, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was barely 5 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest point, a chunk of volcanic rock, dominated by the extinct volcano Mount Suribachi. It was strategically valuable. Its airfields could serve as emergency landing sites for damaged B-29s returning from Japan, and as a base for fighter escorts. But for the 21,000 Japanese defenders under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, it was sacred ground, just 750 miles from Tokyo. They would make it a killing ground. On February 19, 1945, after 3 days of naval bombardment that accomplished little against Japanese positions buried deep underground, the Marines went ashore. The beaches were black volcanic sand that offered no cover and no concealment. The Marines couldn't dig in. Their entrenching tools couldn't penetrate the volcanic ash. As they struggled inland, Japanese artillery and mortar fire erupted from positions on Mount Suribachi and from caves and bunkers across the island. Casualties mounted with terrifying speed. 4 days later, a Marine patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised a small American flag. Later that day, a photographer named Joe Rosenthal captured 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman raising a larger flag. His photograph would become the most famous image of World War II, an enduring symbol of American determination, but the battle was far from over. For 31 more days, the Marines fought forward yard by yard through a hellscape of bunkers, caves, and fortified positions. The Japanese had created a defense in depth, with 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting positions. Artillery would fire from a cave opening, then disappear underground before American counter-battery fire could destroy it. Marines used flamethrowers, demolition charges, and tank-mounted guns to reduce positions one by one. They called certain sections the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge for the casualties sustained there. When it ended on March 26, 1945, the statistics were horrifying: 821 Americans killed, 217 wounded. Japanese losses were nearly total. Of 25,000 defenders, only 216 survived to be captured. It remains the only major Pacific battle where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Admiral Chester Nimitz, visiting the island afterward, said it best: among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. But if Iwo Jima was hell, Okinawa was the descent into something worse. Okinawa was ancestral Japanese territory, the last island before the home islands themselves. The Japanese garrison numbered 100,000 troops, backed by tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians who had been conscripted as laborers or coerced into militia service. American planners expected fierce resistance. What they got exceeded their worst nightmares. The invasion began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, and appropriately nicknamed L-Day, in what someone grimly joked stood for Love Day. The initial landings were almost unopposed. Over 60,000 troops came ashore with minimal casualties. For a few hours, soldiers and Marines dared to hope this might be easy. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had no intention of meeting the Americans at the beaches. He had withdrawn his forces to the southern part of the island, into terrain perfectly suited for defense. Rocky ridges, steep escarpments, fortified caves. There, he would bleed the Americans white, and bleed them he did. For 82 days, American forces battered themselves against Japanese positions with names that would become synonymous with hell on earth. Sugarloaf Hill, Hacksaw Ridge, the Shuri Line. Marines assaulted Sugarloaf Hill 8 times over 8 days, taking horrific casualties each time before finally securing it. At Hacksaw Ridge, Army medic Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, single-handedly rescued 75 wounded soldiers under fire, lowering them down a 400-foot escarpment one by one. He would receive the Medal of Honor. Rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. Vehicles bogged down. Wounded men drowned in shell holes. Bodies, American and Japanese, were churned into the muck by artillery fire. The psychological toll was devastating. Battle fatigue casualties exceeded 10,000. Men simply broke under the strain of continuous combat in conditions that beggared description. At sea, the nightmare was equally terrible. The Japanese launched mass kamikaze attacks, wave after wave of suicide aircraft crashing into American ships. The Navy's radar picket destroyers, stationed around Okinawa to provide early warning, bore the brunt of the attacks. The destroyer USS Laffey fought off 22 kamikaze aircraft in 80 minutes, was hit by 6 of them and 4 bombs, and somehow stayed afloat. Nearly 40% of American deaths at Okinawa were Navy personnel killed by kamikazes. Over 4,900 American sailors died, 36 ships were sunk, 368 damaged. The civilian casualties were equally horrifying. Okinawan civilians, caught between 2 armies, died by the tens of thousands. The Japanese military forced many into suicide attacks, or used them as human shields. American artillery and air strikes killed many more. When the battle ended, over 100 Zerozen Okinawan civilians were dead out of a pre-war population of 300 Zerozen. Entire villages were wiped from existence. When Okinawa was finally declared secure on June 25, 1945, the butcher's bill was staggering. 520 Americans killed or missing, over 36,000 wounded. Japanese deaths exceeded 100,000. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide as American forces closed in on his headquarters. And American planners, looking at those casualty figures, looking at the fanatical Japanese resistance, began planning for Operation Downfall. The invasion of Japan itself. Casualty estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American dead. The Japanese had 2.5 million troops in the home islands, backed by millions of armed civilians, trained to resist with bamboo spears and improvised explosives. But before Operation Downfall could be launched, something happened that changed everything. On August 6 and 9, 1945, B-29 bombers flying from Tinian, an island captured in the island hopping campaign, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The island hopping campaign and the war was over. The Pacific Island hopping campaign lasted 3 years and 8 months, from Guadalcanal in August 1942 to the Japanese surrender in August 1945. In that time, American forces advanced over 4,000 miles from the southern Solomons to Okinawa, capturing dozens of islands and atolls, destroying the Japanese Navy and Air Force, and positioning themselves for the final assault on Japan. The strategic brilliance of island hopping is undeniable. By bypassing heavily defended Japanese strongholds and instead capturing lightly defended islands that could support the next advance, American forces conserved lives and resources while maintaining offensive momentum. Bases like Rabaul, which would have cost tens of thousands of casualties to capture, were simply isolated and rendered irrelevant. The strategy allowed America to leverage its industrial and naval superiority while minimizing its one relative weakness, the willingness to accept unlimited casualties. But the cost in blood was terrible nonetheless. Over 100,000 Americans died in the Pacific theater. Many more were wounded, physically and psychologically. Entire units were decimated. The 1st Marine Division suffered 60% casualties on Peleliu. The 2nd Marine Division lost over 3,000 men at Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian. The 77th Infantry Division fought from Guam to Okinawa, suffering casualties in every battle. Some men fought in every major campaign and somehow survived. Many did not. Behind the strategic overview, behind the maps with their arrows showing American advances, behind the statistics and casualty figures, were individual stories of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. There was Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas, who at age 17 was the youngest Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. At Iwo Jima, he threw himself on 2 grenades to save his comrades. Somehow, he survived, though his body was riddled with over 200 pieces of shrapnel. There was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, who could have spent the rest of the war stateside selling war bonds. He volunteered to return to combat instead, and died on the beaches of Iwo Jima in February 1945, killed by a mortar round while single-handedly destroying a Japanese blockhouse. There were the men of the destroyer, USS Johnston, who charged a Japanese battleship force off Samar, and fought until their ship was shot to pieces beneath them. Of the 327 men aboard, 186 died. The rest, including Captain Ernest Evans, were never found. There were the thousands of Marines who died taking islands most Americans had never heard of and would never remember. Peleliu, Roy, Namur, Ngebe, Angkor, Emero, men who died because their country asked them to, because duty demanded it, because the strategy required it. The island-hopping campaign proved that modern amphibious warfare was possible on a scale never before attempted. It demonstrated that industrial might, properly applied, could overcome defensive advantages that seemed insurmountable. It showed that a nation's will to fight could be sustained over years of brutal combat across thousands of miles of ocean. But most importantly, it revealed the depth of courage and sacrifice that ordinary men were capable of when asked to do the extraordinary. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, clerks from New York, and cowboys from Texas. They became Marines and soldiers and sailors, and they crossed an ocean to fight and die on islands they couldn't pronounce, for reasons that sometimes seemed incomprehensible. Because their nation was at war and they were needed. The Pacific Island hopping campaign was a masterpiece of strategic planning. But its true legacy isn't measured in square miles captured or Japanese divisions destroyed. It's measured in the blood of American servicemen who bought each island with their lives, who transformed the vast emptiness of the Pacific from an impassable barrier into a highway to victory. They didn't ask for monuments. Most didn't live to see the victory they died to achieve. But they earned something more permanent than stone and bronze. They earned the eternal gratitude of a nation they saved, and the respect of history itself. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive.